The ballroom was a sea of opulence, with glistening chandeliers casting warm, golden light over the guests. Every detail had been carefully planned, from the delicate flowers hanging from the ceiling to the expensive wine flowing freely. The guests, dressed in their finest, mingled and chatted, exchanging polite smiles, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the altar, waiting for the bride to arrive. But the bride wasn't the only person everyone was waiting for. The CEO, Damien Lefebvre, stood at the front of the room, his back straight, his posture exuding the confidence that had built his billion-dollar empire. He wore a sharp black tuxedo, his perfectly styled hair not a strand out of place. His green eyes, usually piercing and full of authority, were now filled with a nervous energy he couldn't shake. He had invited her. He had invited his ex-wife, but now that the moment had come, he regretted it. It wasn't that he hadn't tried to get over the past. It wasn't that he hadn't told himself it would be okay. It wasn't that he hadn't convinced himself it was all for the sake of closure. But standing there, waiting for her arrival, Damien couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. He had always been good at reading people, at sensing when something wasn't right. And right now, everything about this situation felt off. The wedding was supposed to be a new chapter in his life. A fresh start with Isabel, the woman he had fallen in love with after the collapse of his first marriage. Isabel had brought light into his world. She understood him in ways no one else ever had. She was kind, smart, and beautiful, everything he had ever wanted. They'd been engaged for 6 months, and today was supposed to be the culmination of that love. But the ghost of his past had come to haunt him, and now, he couldn't escape it. A low murmur of conversation filled the room as the guests waited. Damien adjusted his bow tie and glanced nervously at the entrance, his fingers drumming lightly against the arm of the chair beside him. He'd heard from his lawyers that she would be here. He'd heard from a few mutual friends that she planned to make an appearance. But hearing and seeing were two very different things. Finally, the doors to the ballroom opened. The noise in the room stopped immediately. Everyone turned their heads. And there she was. Sophia Lefebvre, his ex-wife, was standing in the doorway, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She wore a simple black dress, a contrast to the extravagant gowns that the other women in the room sported, but it suited her. She had always been effortlessly beautiful, and it was clear that time had not diminished her in the slightest. She hadn't aged a day. Damien's breath caught in his chest. His mind raced as he tried to remember the last time he had seen her. Had it really been 5 years? The memories flooded back, the good and the bad. They had been married for a short, intense period before everything fell apart. But seeing her here now, he couldn't deny the jolt of emotion that coursed through him. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the lavish setting with an air of quiet confidence. She wasn't here to make a scene. No, she had something else planned. Damien's grip on the chair tightened, his jaw setting in a hard line. She had always been unpredictable, capable of walking into any room and leaving a mark. But today? Today felt different. And then, just as he thought it couldn't get any worse, something else caught his eye. A child. A boy, no older than 7, stood beside her, his small hand held tightly in hers. He was looking around the room, his expression unreadable, but what struck Damien most was how eerily familiar he looked. The boy was staring at the guests in front of him, his wide eyes a mirror image of Damien's own. Damien's heart skipped a beat. No, it couldn't be. The boy's features were identical to his own. The same green eyes, the same sharp jawline, the same tousled brown hair. It was like looking at a younger version of himself. The room was silent now. The guests exchanged confused glances, trying to understand the situation, but no one dared to speak. Damien's chest tightened. His breath came in shallow bursts as he took a step forward, his mind reeling. His stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Sophia hadn't even looked at him yet. She had walked in, quietly confident, as if she were merely another guest. But the boy? The boy was the one who had caught everyone's attention. "Damien," Sophia finally said, her voice calm and composed. "It's been a long time." Her words were like a slap to the face, pulling him out of his daze. He turned his gaze toward her, his eyes narrowing. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in the way she looked at him that sent a chill down his spine. The boy remained silent, standing at her side like a shadow. His eyes flicked briefly to Damien, but he quickly looked away, his expression unreadable. "Is everything all right?" Isabel's voice broke through the tension. She stood beside him now, her brow furrowed, her eyes darting between Damien and Sophia. She had been watching the scene unfold, confusion clouding her face. Damien didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the boy. Sophia stepped closer to him, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. She was so close now that he could smell her perfume, the same scent she had worn all those years ago. The familiar scent triggered something deep inside him, something he hadn't expected. A memory, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. "This is my son," Sophia said, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. She spoke with the same calm composure she always had, as though nothing was out of the ordinary. "I think it's time you met him." Damien blinked, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. His son? This child? It was impossible. He turned to Isabel, her hand still resting lightly on his arm, and then back to Sophia. His voice caught in his throat. This can't be real." Sophia's lips curled into a faint smile. "Oh, it's real, Damien. Very real." The boy didn't speak, but he met Damien's gaze again. This time, his expression was more intense. Almost knowing. Damien's pulse quickened. The boy looked so much like him, but that couldn't be possible. He had never had a child. He had never been told about a child. And yet, here he was. Isabel squeezed his arm. "What does she mean? Damien, what's going on?" But he couldn't answer. He was too consumed by the shock, by the rush of emotions flooding him. The world around him felt blurry, as if he were underwater. Sophia turned to the boy. "Go ahead," she said softly. "Say hello to your father." The boy stepped forward, his tiny footsteps echoing in the silence of the room. He stopped right in front of Damien and raised his eyes to meet his. There was no fear, no hesitation. Just a deep, unsettling calm. "I'm your son," the boy said simply. Damien's heart was pounding in his chest, the rhythm almost deafening in his ears. He stood frozen, staring down at the child in front of him, still struggling to process what had just been said. His son? Impossible. It couldn't be true. The room felt suddenly smaller, suffocating. The guest's murmurs faded into the background as his mind raced, trying to make sense of this incomprehensible situation. His son. The words echoed in his head over and over. Isabel, standing beside him, was pale, her eyes wide in confusion and disbelief. She looked from him to Sophia and then to the boy. "Damien, what's going on? What is this?" Damien opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat was dry. His hands shook slightly, betraying the cool facade he usually wore so effortlessly. He turned to Sophia, who stood across from him, calm as ever. "You can't be serious," he finally managed to say, his voice thick with disbelief. "You're telling me that this child is mine?" Sophia's gaze never wavered. She didn't look angry, sad, or even apologetic. She simply looked, matter of fact. "I am," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange weight. "And I've come here today to tell you the truth. The truth about him. About everything." Damien's mind was a whirlwind, a storm of emotions and questions. His mind flashed back to their time together, to the fractured memories of their marriage. Their relationship had ended badly. There had been arguments, misunderstandings, and betrayals. But a child? A son? He had never been told. He had never even suspected. Isabel's grip on his arm tightened, and he could feel her anxiety radiating off of her. Damien, what is this? Who is this boy? Damien shook his head, trying to steady his thoughts. He wanted to believe this was some cruel joke, a prank.
He wanted to believe that Sophia had brought this boy here to mess with him. But deep down, he knew. The boy's eyes were too familiar. The resemblance was too striking. I need to sit down, he muttered, his legs feeling like jelly as he stepped back. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked toward the nearest chair, sinking into it as though the weight of the world had just been placed on his shoulders. Sophia moved closer, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. You've always been good at pretending, Damien. But you can't pretend anymore. Not now. Not with him here. Damien's hands curled into fists at his sides. I don't understand. You never told me. You never said anything. Why didn't you? Sophia cut him off, her tone surprisingly gentle. Because you wouldn't have listened. You would have denied it. You would have fought me every step of the way. I knew you wouldn't believe it until you saw him for yourself. The boy, who had been silently standing beside his mother, took a step forward. He was small, no more than 7 years old, but there was a quiet maturity in his gaze. He looked up at Damien with those deep green eyes, eyes that mirrored his own so closely it sent a chill down his spine. You're my dad, the boy said again, his voice soft but firm. I know you are. Damien swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He had to be dreaming. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. He'd never even suspected that Sophia had kept something like this from him. They had ended their marriage so suddenly, so messily. He had never thought to ask her about a child. Why didn't you tell me about him, Sophia? Damien asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Why didn't you let me know? Sophia finally sat down in the chair beside him, her expression unreadable. Because I didn't want him to be caught in the middle of our mess. We both know how badly things ended. But you have a right to know, Damien. You have a right to know him. Damien turned to look at the boy again, his heart still racing. Why didn't you tell me when he was born? Why wait until now? Sophia's gaze softened. It wasn't easy, Damien. You had moved on. You had your life. I didn't want to disrupt it. But things have changed. He's getting older, and it's time for you to meet him. He deserves to know his father. The words were almost too much to bear. The weight of what she was saying sank in. He had a son. A son he had never known. A son who was standing right in front of him, waiting for him to acknowledge him. Damien ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. He thought of Isabel, who was still standing next to him, her face a mix of confusion and concern. She was waiting for an explanation, but he had no answers. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to think. Isabel, he finally said, his voice hoarse. I didn't know. I didn't know about him. I swear. Isabel nodded slowly, though.
Her expression didn't soften. I understand, Damien. But we need to figure this out. We can't just ignore it. This changes everything. Damien's eyes flicked back to Sophia, and for the first time in years, he saw something different in her eyes. Not anger. Not bitterness. But something that could have been regret. Or perhaps something deeper. You don't need to worry about that, Sophia said, her voice low and steady. This isn't about us anymore, Damien. This is about him. The boy was still staring at him, waiting. His gaze was so intense, so sure. Damien felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He didn't know what to do. How could he possibly be a father when he had no idea how to even begin? Sophia leaned in closer, her voice soft. I didn't bring him here to disrupt your life, Damien. I brought him here because he deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know who you are. And you deserve to know him. Damien looked back at the boy. He had never imagined anything like this. He had never imagined that his past could come back to him in such a powerful way. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time. The chatter of the guests, the sound of the music in the background, all of it faded into a distant hum. All that remained was the boy standing in front of him, waiting for him to acknowledge him as his father. And Damien didn't know if he could. I don't know what to say, Damien whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I never expected this. I never thought. Sophia's eyes softened. It's okay, Damien. You don't have to say anything right now. Just take your time. But know that he's not going anywhere. Damien's eyes were fixed on the boy again. The silence between them seemed to stretch on forever. The boy didn't speak again, but his eyes said everything. He was waiting for Damien to make the first move. Waiting for him to reach out and claim him as his son. Damien felt his heart tighten in his chest. He had spent years building a life without any idea of this boy's existence. He had buried his past with Sophia, never once thinking about what could have been. Now, here it was, staring him in the face. He didn't know if he was ready. But one thing was clear, his life would never be the same again. Damien sat in the chair, his fingers gripping the armrests as though he could steady himself that way. His mind was still spinning from the shock of the past few minutes. His son. The boy standing in front of him, his flesh and blood. He couldn't make sense of it. Couldn't understand how it was possible that all these years, all this time, he had never known. Sophia was sitting across from him, her calm demeanor betraying no hint of the turmoil Damien could feel in his chest. She wasn't saying anything now, just watching him with those same cool, almost detached eyes. It was as though she had expected this reaction from him. As though she had known he wouldn't believe it, that he would be stunned into silence. Isabel was standing off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes darting between Damien and Sophia. She hadn't said much since the boy had spoken, but Damien could feel her confusion and her unease in the air. Her eyes were filled with a mix of concern and hurt, and he knew that he had to explain, somehow, what was happening. But what could he say? He had no answers. He didn't know what was real anymore. The boy, his son, was still standing by Sophia's side, his small hand gripping her dress. He hadn't said anything else, but his gaze was unwavering, focused on Damien like he was waiting for something. He was patient, almost too patient for someone so young, but there was a certain intensity in his eyes. He was waiting for Damien to make the next move. To acknowledge him, to take the first step. Damien rubbed his face with both hands, as though trying to clear the fog from his mind. I don't understand, he muttered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. How could you hide this from me, Sophia? Sophia didn't flinch at the accusation. Instead, she looked at him with those steady, calm eyes. I didn't hide anything from you, Damien. I didn't tell you. There's a difference. A difference? His voice cracked with frustration. You kept this from me for 7 years, and you're telling me there's a difference? She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the boy, her expression softening for just a moment before she looked back at him. I didn't want to complicate your life. You had moved on. You were building something new with Isabel. I didn't want to tear that apart. Damien could feel his anger rising again, but he kept it in check. It wasn't about the anger anymore. It was about the fact that there was a child, his child, that he had never known. He had lived all these years thinking he was free from the past, free from the pain of his failed marriage. And now, this boy had appeared, ripping apart the life he had built since then. "This isn't about Isabel," Damien said, his voice more controlled now. "This is about you and me. You kept something so important from me. You didn't give me the chance to be part of his life." Sophia's eyes softened again, and for the first time, Damien saw a flicker of regret in them. "I know. I didn't want to hurt you. But you deserve to know the truth, Damien. You deserve to know him." Damien closed his eyes, trying to breathe through the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He turned his gaze to the boy again, his son. There was something about the child that made Damien's chest tighten. It was the way he looked at him, with an almost unsettling familiarity. The resemblance was undeniable, and yet, Damien couldn't understand how this could be his son. He had never been told, never even suspected that Sophia had been pregnant when they were together. "What's his name?" Isabel finally spoke, breaking the silence that had descended upon the room. Sophia's eyes flicked to her, and for a brief moment, Damien saw something in her eyes that he couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Regret? It didn't matter, he supposed. What mattered was what she said next. "His name is Lucas," Sophia replied, her voice steady. Lucas. The name sat heavy in the air, as if it were a weight that would crush everything in its path. Damien's mind was still reeling, but the name, simple and ordinary, grounded him for a moment. Lucas. His son. A child he had never known, a child who would never know the kind of father Damien had dreamed of being. "I don't understand," Damien whispered again, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "Why now? Why show up today? Why bring him here, of all places?" Sophia shifted in her chair, her eyes never leaving him. "Because it's time, Damien. It's time for you to meet him. Time for you to see him for who he is." A heavy silence fell over the room, and for the first time since Lucas had spoken, Damien finally found the strength to look at the boy again. He was still standing there, looking up at him with those same piercing green eyes. Damien couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas was older than his years. There was a maturity to the boy's gaze, something that felt almost too wise for someone so young. You really think I can just accept this?" Damien asked, his voice raw. "You think I can just wake up one day and be a father? I don't even know what that means." Sophia leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't expect you to have all the answers, Damien. But I think you owe it to him to try. You owe it to yourself to try." Damien ran his fingers through his hair again, trying to organize his thoughts. Nothing about this made sense. It wasn't just the shock of finding out he had a son. It was the way everything was happening, the way everything seemed to be unraveling all at once. And then, something strange happened. Lucas took a step forward, breaking the silence. His small hands reached out, and before anyone could stop him, he placed his hand gently on Damien's arm. "I'm not going anywhere," Lucas said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "You don't have to worry. I'll be here." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Damien's heart skipped a beat. There was something almost too certain in the boy's words. It was as though Lucas had known, deep down, that this would happen. That this was the moment when everything would change. Damien looked down at the boy's hand on his arm, feeling a sudden rush of emotions that he couldn't quite place. He had never thought about fatherhood, had never expected to be in a position where he had to make a choice. But here it was, in front of him, the reality of his past catching up with him in the form of a child. Sophia stood up then, her gaze still fixed on him. "Damien, I know this is hard. I know you never expected this. But we can't keep running from the past. You have a son. And whether you want to accept it or not, he needs you. Isabel had been silent for a while, watching the exchange between Damien and Sophia. Now, she stepped forward, her voice soft but full of concern. Damien, we need to talk about this. We can't ignore it. We need to figure out what happens next. Damien turned to Isabel, his eyes searching hers. She was right. He couldn't just push this aside. The truth was out there now, and he couldn't pretend it didn't matter. I don't know what comes next, he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. But I know I need to figure this out. Sophia nodded, as though she had expected that answer. That's all I'm asking. Just take it one step at a time. Lucas's small hand remained on his arm, and for a moment, it felt as if the boy was holding him together. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, Damien felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could figure this out. The silence that fell after Lucas's words was unbearable. Damien sat frozen, the child's hand still resting lightly on his arm. A strange mixture of emotions swirled in his chest, confusion, guilt, anger, and something else. It was like standing at the edge of an unknown abyss, unsure of whether to jump or turn away. He didn't know how to do this. He had never imagined his life would lead him here, sitting in a lavish room, surrounded by the people who were supposed to be part of his future, while his past, this secret, this child, demanded his attention. Damien, Isabel's voice broke the stillness, and he turned toward her. She was standing beside him now, her expression unreadable but full of concern. You have to talk to me. You can't just shut down. He blinked, realizing how distant he must have appeared. His mind was racing, and for a moment, he had forgotten that Isabel was there, too. She was a part of this, his life, his present, his future. He opened his mouth to speak but found that the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That his world had just been turned upside down by a child he had never known? That he didn't even know how to begin to process the fact that this boy, Lucas, was his son? Instead of speaking, Damien pulled his arm away from Lucas, who looked up at him with those eerily familiar green eyes, a mixture of hope and trust in his gaze. The boy's fingers lingered for just a moment, as if he was afraid Damien would reject him. I'm sorry, Damien muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. I don't know what to say. Sophia, who had been standing quietly by, watching them, finally spoke. Her voice was gentle, but there was an edge to it. You don't have to say anything, Damien. Not yet. But you do have to look at him. You do have to see him for who he is. Damien turned his eyes back to the boy. Lucas was still standing there, watching him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. It wasn't a gaze of expectation, but rather of quiet understanding. The boy wasn't demanding anything from him. He wasn't asking for love or affection. He was simply waiting, as though he knew this was the beginning of something important, something that had been long overdue. I don't know if I can do this, Damien admitted, his voice low. His throat felt tight, like he had swallowed something sharp. I don't know if I'm ready. Sophia took a step forward, her eyes softening. You don't have to be ready, Damien. You just have to try. That's all. For a moment, everything felt overwhelming. His entire world had been neatly compartmentalized, his work, his success, his relationship with Isabel. But now, all of it was threatening to unravel. A son. A child who, despite everything, seemed to be a part of him, in a way that no one else could be. The weight of the responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical presence. He hadn't asked for this. Hell, he hadn't even known it existed. And yet, here it was. I need some time, Damien said, his voice strained. He stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back. The room seemed to close in on him. The air felt thick, suffocating. He needed space. He needed air. Isabel's hand reached out, grabbing his arm as he moved to walk away. Damien, don't shut me out. Don't shut us out. We need to talk about this. I need to know where we stand. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with frustration and confusion. He didn't want to shut her out. He didn't want to hurt her. But this was something he couldn't share with her. Not yet. He couldn't bring her into the chaos of his mind, the whirlwind of emotions he was trying to sort through. I don't know where we stand, he whispered, pulling away from her grasp. Not right now. Isabel's face fell, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stepped back, her eyes searching his for some sign of what he was feeling. But Damien had no answers for her, and for the first time in their relationship, he didn't feel like he had any control over the situation. Damien turned and walked toward the balcony, needing the fresh air, needing to clear his head. As he stepped outside, the cool night breeze hit him, offering a brief moment of relief. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the city below. He didn't know how long he stood there, lost in his thoughts, when he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Sophia. She stood beside him, but there was a distance between them. Not just physical, but emotional. A distance that hadn't been there before. You're thinking about leaving, aren't you? Sophia said quietly, her voice almost lost in the wind. Damien didn't answer. He didn't need to. She knew him too well. I won't let you leave, Sophia continued. Not like this. Damien turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. I never asked for this. I didn't ask for any of this. Sophia's expression softened, though there was still a hint of determination in her eyes. You never asked for Lucas either, but he's here now. And he's a part of you. Whether you want him to be or not. Damien clenched his jaw, trying to swallow the anger and frustration rising inside him. You should have told me sooner. I deserve to know the truth. Sophia's face hardened for a brief moment, but then she sighed, as if giving in to something deep inside. I know. I'm sorry. But I thought it would be easier this way. For you, for him. I didn't want you to be forced into a decision you weren't ready to make. Damien looked at her, his mind whirling with questions. And now? Now that you've brought him here, what do you want from me? I don't want anything, she said quietly. I just want you to know him. To see him. To try. Damien shook his head, his chest tightening with the weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours. I don't know how to do that. Sophia reached out, her hand brushing his arm. You don't have to know. Just take it one step at a time. Damien closed his eyes, letting out a shaky breath. One step at a time, he repeated, as if testing the words on his lips. Sophia's voice softened. Damien, you don't have to do this alone. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. There was sincerity there, but also something deeper, something that was buried beneath the surface, hidden beneath layers of regret, time, and distance. I don't know how to be a father, Sophia, Damien admitted, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. I don't know if I can be. You don't have to be perfect, she said gently. You just have to try. He's your son, Damien. He's part of you. And he deserves to know you. For the first time since he had learned the truth, Damien felt something in his chest stir. It wasn't hope, not exactly. But it was something, a flicker of understanding, of possibility. I'm scared, he whispered. Sophia nodded, her eyes softening. I know. But it's okay to be scared. What matters is that you try. Damien stood there in silence, the weight of his past, his future, and his decisions pressing down on him. He didn't know what was next. He didn't know how to navigate this new reality. But he knew one thing, he couldn't keep running away from it. He couldn't pretend that Lucas wasn't his son. The boy deserved better than that. As he stood there on the balcony, with Sophia beside him, he realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. And though the road ahead would be difficult, maybe it wasn't too late to try. Maybe it wasn't too late to be a father. The morning after the chaotic revelation was no less overwhelming. Damien had hardly slept, the image of Lucas's face, the boy who was supposed to be his son, replaying over and over in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those bright green eyes staring back at him with that unspoken hope. Sophia had left early that morning, perhaps knowing he needed time alone to process everything. Isabel, on the other hand, had been quieter than usual. She didn't push him to talk, but Damien could feel the weight of her eyes on him every time he moved around the house, every time their paths crossed. He couldn't escape the fact that there was a child out there, a child who might one day call him dad, and he was unsure whether he was ready to take on that role. The thought of being a father filled him with dread, and yet, there was something about Lucas that pulled at him, a magnetic connection that he couldn't ignore. Sitting at the kitchen table, Damien stared into his coffee cup, watching the steam rise in swirls. The silence in the room was deafening, and he couldn't help but feel that the clock was ticking. Time wasn't on his side anymore. He had to make decisions, whether he was ready or not. Damien? Isabel's voice cut through the quiet, and he looked up, meeting her gaze. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. He had expected anger, perhaps even disappointment, but what he saw was something more subtle, a deep sadness, as though she was mourning something she couldn't quite put into words. "You've been distant all morning," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I get it, Damien. I really do. But I need to know where I stand. I need you to talk to me." Damien's chest tightened, guilt clawing at his insides. How could he explain the mess inside his head? How could he explain that, even though he cared for Isabel deeply, this child, Lucas, was pulling him in a direction he never expected to go? "I don't know what to say," he finally replied, his voice rough. Isabel walked toward him, sitting down across from him. She placed her hand on his, her fingers warm against his cold skin. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Damien. But I can't stand here and pretend like everything is fine. This changes everything. And you're not the only one who's struggling with it." Damien closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. He knew she was right. This situation had rattled both of them. But how could he explain to her that his entire world had shifted overnight? "It's not just about me," he muttered, lifting his eyes to meet hers. "It's about him. About Lucas." Isabel's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand gently. "I know. But you don't have to figure it all out at once. What matters is that you try. Try for him. Try for us." "I'm scared, Isabel," Damien confessed, his voice breaking. "I'm scared that I'm going to fail him. That I'm not capable of being the father he deserves." Isabel didn't say anything at first. Instead, she stood and walked around the table to stand behind him. Her hand settled on his shoulder, and she leaned down, her lips close to his ear. "You don't have to do it alone," she whispered. "We're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." Her words should have brought him comfort, but instead, they only deepened his sense of helplessness. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that everything could be fixed, that they could make this work. But deep down, a voice inside him wondered if he was too broken to fix anything. Suddenly, a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Isabel glanced toward it, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she stood and walked toward the door, opening it to reveal Sophia standing in the hallway. Damien's stomach dropped. He hadn't expected her to come by so soon. Sophia gave him a small, hesitant smile before looking at Isabel. "Can I talk to him? Just for a minute?" Isabel's gaze flickered to Damien, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a flash of something that wasn't just concern. But she nodded, stepping aside to allow Sophia in. Sophia closed the door softly behind her and turned to face Damien, her expression serious. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. Damien felt a knot form in his stomach. "About what?" he asked, even though he already knew. "I need to explain some things," Sophia said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know this isn't easy for you, but you deserve the truth. All of it." Damien stared at her, his heart racing. "Go ahead," he said, his voice tight with tension. Sophia took a deep breath and looked away for a moment, as though gathering the courage to speak. "Lucas isn't just your son. There's more to the story than you know. And I've kept it from you because I didn't know how to tell you." Damien's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about the child anymore. There was something else, something bigger, lurking beneath the surface. Sophia's eyes filled with emotion. "Lucas is your son, yes. But he's also a part of a much bigger story, a story I've been keeping from you for years. And it's time you knew everything." Damien's mind raced. What could be more than the fact that this child, this boy, was his son? "I don't understand," he whispered. Sophia shook her head, her voice growing softer. "I'm sorry for not telling you earlier. I thought I could protect you from it, but now I can't keep running from the truth." The silence in the room felt suffocating as Sophia gathered her thoughts, her hands trembling as she folded them in front of her. "I knew your father," she finally said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I knew him before you did. And I was closer to him than you could ever imagine." Damien's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? What does my father have to do with this?" Sophia stepped forward, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Damien, your father wasn't just a businessman. He was involved in things you wouldn't believe. And Lucas is the key to everything." Damien shook his head, his mind reeling. This was too much. Too many secrets. Too many unanswered questions. "I don't understand any of this," he said, his voice cracking with disbelief. Sophia took a deep breath. "I'll explain everything, I promise. But we have to start at the beginning. You have to understand what your father was really involved in. And you have to understand that Lucas is a part of something far bigger than either of us." Damien stood there, speechless. His entire world had just shattered once again. What could be bigger than this? What could be more than the fact that he had a son who needed him? Sophia stepped back, her face pale. "I'll tell you everything. But we need to do this together. All of us. If we don't, we're going to lose Lucas. And we'll lose everything." Damien's mind whirled. This was no longer just about him. It was about Lucas. It was about everything he didn't know, everything he couldn't understand. One thing was clear now. His life would never be the same again. Damien sat in the darkened study, the old oak desk before him covered in papers, photographs, and cryptic documents he hadn't expected to see. The walls of the room seemed to close in around him, the weight of everything pressing down on his shoulders. His father's legacy, the family business, the secretive dealings, all of it had led him to this moment. But it was the face of Lucas, staring up at him from the photograph in his hand, that weighed most heavily on his heart. The boy, his son, had no idea what kind of legacy he was born into. And Damien wasn't sure how to protect him from it. The truth Sophia had revealed earlier had been a bombshell, shattering the calm surface of his life in ways he couldn't have predicted. His father's connections were deeper and darker than anything Damien had ever imagined. And Lucas, this innocent child, was at the center of it all. The front door creaked open, signaling Isabel's return. He didn't turn to acknowledge her presence right away. He couldn't. The world he thought he understood had turned into a maze, and every corner he turned revealed more secrets. Damien? Isabel's voice echoed softly through the room. She didn't sound angry, just tired, as if she, too, was carrying the burden of uncertainty. We need to talk. He finally looked up, his eyes locking with hers. Isabel stood in the doorway, her face pale, her expression uncertain. She was as much a part of this as he was, but in many ways, she seemed like a spectator to a tragedy that was unfolding in slow motion. I know, he said quietly, his voice distant. I'm sorry I've been distant, Isabel. It's just, all of this. I don't even know where to begin. She nodded, stepping into the room and sitting down across from him. You don't have to explain everything right now, Damien. But I need to know, what are you going to do? What's your plan? He shook his head, his fingers tightening around the photograph of Lucas. I don't know. I don't even know what my role in this is anymore, Isabel. This isn't just about me. This is about my father, about his past, and now Lucas. I don't know how I can protect him from what's coming. Isabel sat quietly for a moment, watching him, before she spoke again. You don't have to face this alone. We're in this together, Damien. I'm with you. But we need to figure this out. We can't keep running from it. Damien felt the warmth of her words, but the fear inside him only grew. What if he couldn't protect Lucas? What if this child, this boy, was already doomed to repeat the same mistakes his father had made? I don't know how to fix this, Damien said, his voice cracking. I've made so many mistakes, Isabel. I've never been the man I should have been, and now I'm supposed to be someone's father. I don't even know where to start. You start by being honest, Isabel replied gently. With yourself, with Lucas, with everyone. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take one step at a time. Her words hung in the air, but Damien wasn't sure he believed them. Could he really do this? Could he rise above the mistakes of his past and become the man Lucas needed? He felt like he was drowning in doubt, and there was no life raft in sight. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Isabel stood up, looking at Damien before she walked over to answer it. Damien didn't look up. He was lost in thought, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him harder than before. Sophia walked in without waiting for an invitation, her eyes red from the tears that had clearly been shed. She didn't say anything at first, just walked straight to Damien and sat down beside him. Damien, I know this is hard, she said quietly, her voice soft, but resolute. I've been trying to shield you from the truth for years, but now there's no escaping it. You need to understand what you're about to get into. Damien's head snapped up. What do you mean? What else is there? Sophia's face twisted with the weight of the past. Your father's business dealings weren't just about money, Damien. He was involved in things that were dangerous. People would do anything to protect their secrets, and that includes hurting people. Is that what you meant when you said Lucas is the key? Damien asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. Sophia nodded slowly. Yes. Lucas is the son of someone powerful, someone who's connected to all of this. Your father's business wasn't just about wealth and power. It was about control. And Lucas. Lucas is the one person who can bring everything crashing down. Damien's stomach churned. This was more than he had bargained for. His father's legacy wasn't just about success and the empire he had built, it was about corruption, crime, and now, the very life of his son. And what does that mean for me? Damien asked, his voice barely a whisper. What does that mean for Lucas? Sophia met his gaze, her eyes filled with regret. It means you need to protect him at all costs. Because there are people who will stop at nothing to get to him. People who will hurt anyone standing in their way. Damien's mind reeled. He had thought his problems were bad, but now they felt insignificant compared to what he was facing. There was a dark force out there, and it was closing in on them. "We need to move fast," Sophia continued. "We can't stay here. They know about Lucas, and they'll come for him." Damien's chest tightened as the enormity of the situation sank in. His life was no longer his own. He was in the middle of a war he hadn't signed up for, a war that would cost him everything if he wasn't careful. "We'll leave," Isabel said suddenly, her voice firm. "We'll go somewhere safe. I'll help you, Damien. I'll be there every step of the way." Sophia turned to look at Isabel, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Are you sure? This isn't just about Damien anymore. This is about everyone." Isabel nodded, unflinching. "I'm sure. He's my family too." Damien looked at both of them, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind was still spinning with the knowledge that his father's past was hunting him down. But now, at least, he wasn't alone. He had Isabel, and he had Sophia, two women who had stood by him through all of this. "We'll do it together," Damien said quietly, more to himself than to them. "But we need to act fast. We need to get Lucas and leave now." The clock was ticking, and Damien felt the weight of the choices ahead of him pressing down with every passing second. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he couldn't afford to fail. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. The house was quiet when Damien and Isabel arrived back at the mansion. They had spent the last few days trying to lay low, but Damien could feel the heat of danger closing in. The room was dim, the air heavy with anticipation, as if the house itself knew that everything was about to change. Sophia had been clear: they didn't have much time. Lucas's life was at risk, and so was their own. The dark forces from Damien's father's past were not far behind. The secret network of powerful men that his father had dealt with had been waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, that moment had arrived. "We can't stay here," Isabel said softly, breaking the silence as she stood by the large window, staring out into the night. "This place isn't safe anymore." Damien's heart sank. The mansion had always been a symbol of everything he had worked for. But now, with the shadow of his father's crimes hanging over them, it felt like a prison. "We don't have a choice," Damien replied, his voice tight. "We need to find Lucas first. If we don't get him, everything is lost." Isabel turned toward him, concern written across her face. "Damien, you can't keep pushing yourself like this. You're not thinking clearly. You need to rest." "I can't rest," he said, his eyes burning with determination. "I have to protect him. My son." Isabel sighed, walking over to him and placing her hand gently on his arm. "I know. But you can't do it alone. We're in this together, okay? I'm with you." Damien looked at her, his heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. He didn't know if he could face what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't do it without her. Suddenly, a knock at the door startled them both. Damien's pulse quickened as he exchanged a brief glance with Isabel. His instincts told him it wasn't good news. He walked cautiously toward the door and opened it to reveal Sophia, standing in the hallway, her face grim. "It's time," she said quietly, her voice filled with urgency. Damien nodded. He knew that this moment was inevitable. There was no more running. It was time to face the truth, to face everything he had been avoiding. But as he stepped into the hallway, a sense of dread washed over him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Lucas, and the web of deceit and danger that surrounded him. "Where's Lucas?" Isabel asked, her voice trembling with concern. "He's safe, for now," Sophia replied. "But we need to move quickly. The people after him won't stop until they have him. We have to leave the city. Tonight." Damien felt a surge of panic. The thought of leaving everything behind, the mansion, his life, his work, was overwhelming. But there was no other choice. They had no time left. They couldn't stay here and risk it all. "I'll get him," Damien said, his voice steady, but the fear still gripping his chest. "Where is he?" Sophia glanced down the hallway. "He's in the guest room. I've been keeping him there, trying to keep him hidden. But it won't be long before they figure out where we are." "Let's go," Damien said firmly. "We don't have time to waste." Together, they walked through the grand house toward the guest room. Every footstep seemed to echo in the silence, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath. Damien's mind raced with questions, but there were no answers yet. He didn't know who was after them or what they wanted. All he knew was that Lucas's safety depended on him, and he wasn't going to fail. As they reached the guest room, Damien's heart skipped a beat. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently and stepped inside, his eyes immediately locking on Lucas, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes wide and innocent. "Lucas," Damien said softly, his voice shaking with emotion. The boy looked up at him, recognition flickering in his eyes. Damien felt an overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness. This was his son. His flesh and blood. And he would do anything to protect him. "Are we leaving?" Lucas asked quietly, his voice small but filled with hope. Damien nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, we're leaving. But we have to be quick. Are you ready?" Lucas nodded, standing up slowly. "Where are we going?" "To safety," Damien replied. "We're going to make sure no one can hurt you." Sophia stepped forward, her gaze softening as she looked at Lucas. "We're going to take care of you, okay? No one's going to hurt you." Damien's heart twisted at the sight of the boy's trusting face. He had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went, how far the danger stretched. But he was determined to keep his son safe, no matter the cost. "We need to get to the car," Sophia said, breaking the tension in the room. "Now." The urgency in her voice snapped Damien back to the present. He turned to Lucas, taking his hand and leading him toward the door. Isabel followed closely behind, and together, they moved through the mansion like shadows, careful not to make a sound. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Damien felt the weight of everything bearing down on him. They had no idea where they were going, no concrete plan, just the desperate need to escape. The world outside seemed eerily quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty road. Damien's pulse raced as he scanned the surroundings, aware that every second could be their last. Sophia led the way to the car, her eyes darting around as if she were expecting someone to appear at any moment. Damien kept close to Lucas, his hand gripping the boys firmly as they reached the vehicle. "Get in," Sophia urged, her voice tense. "We don't have much time." Isabel climbed into the passenger seat, and Lucas slid into the back, with Damien following close behind. Sophia started the engine, the sound of the car's roar filling the quiet night. As they drove away, Damien couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every corner, every streetlight seemed to hold a hidden threat. He glanced at Lucas in the rearview mirror, watching the boy's innocent face, and a pang of guilt shot through him. "What's going to happen now?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. "We're going to be okay," Damien replied, his voice filled with more hope than certainty. "We'll find a safe place, and then we'll figure everything out." But deep down, Damien knew the truth, they were on the run, and nothing was going to be the same again. The life they had known was gone, replaced by an uncertain future filled with danger and uncertainty. As the car sped down the dark highway, Damien looked out the window, trying to ignore the cold dread settling in his chest. But he couldn't escape the truth, the battle had just begun. And the stakes had never been higher. The road ahead was full of unknowns, and as much as Damien wanted to believe that he could protect Lucas from whatever lay ahead, a dark truth settled in his mind: in a world as corrupt and dangerous as this, no one was ever truly safe. But one thing was certain, as long as there was breath in his body, he would fight to the end. For Lucas. For the future. For everything that mattered.